Word. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Claudia Kane. I'm at Scoville Library in Salisbury, and we're really happy that you've been able to join us tonight. So tonight we have two authors dealing with research that they've done on their family histories. I think each book is quite different, but we have Julie Metz, whose latest book is called Eva and Eve, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. She lives in Hudson, New York, and is the author of a previous book, a New York Times best-selling memoir called Perfection. And she has written for publications including the New York Times, Salon, Dame, Tablet, and Catapult. And the essay that inspired her new memoir, Eva and Eve, originally appeared in the anthology, The Moment. She is a fellow of MacDowell, Yaddo, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. And with her is Menachem Kaiser, and he has written a book called Plunder. It is his first book, and he is a writer currently living in Brooklyn. I'm just admitting another person. And he is originally from Toronto, Canada, has a BA from Columbia and an MFA from the University of Michigan. And he was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania, and his fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York, Bomb, Vogue, and elsewhere. And so what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to turn this over to Julie and Menachem. They're each going to talk a little about their books, and then we'll have some questions that I will pose to each of them about the books and their process in writing them. And this recording will be up on the library's YouTube channel. So if you have friends that you'd like to share this with after tonight, please feel free to check it out there. So I am going to vanish and let Menachem and Julie take over.
Okay. Menachem, do you want to do you want to go first, or shall
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay, no problem. This is the book. It's titled Eva and Eve, and this is a story of how my mother's family escaped from Nazi-occupied Vienna in 1940. And it began when, after my mother died, I came across a keepsake book that she had kept in a drawer for many decades. She had never shown it to anybody in the family. And this discovery it sort of perplexed me, but also fascinated me. And I started to research the family and tried to answer the question of how the family had managed to escape. And this turned out to be a story of dogged determination on the part of my grandfather and grandmother. And also, of course, there was luck and some acts of kindness from people that surprised me as along the way. So the research took some years while I went back and forth to Vienna several times. And then I continued the work writing the book after that, and then just published it this past year. So I'll turn that over now to Menachem to give a description of his book before we begin questions.
Hi, everyone. And Julie, it's great to see you again. Thanks, Claudia, for helping organize the event. So my book is called, I have one somewhere, yep, here, called Plunder, a memoir, a family property, not a treasure. The book kind of follows two main threads. Sort of one of them, which I would say forms the core of the book, is my attempts to reclaim property that had belonged to my great-grandfather. And so a lot of that part of the story is sort of me trying to, I would say, approach the memory of my grandfather. I didn't know him. I basically had no concept of who he was or of his personality. I didn't know what he went through in the war. And then in like 2011, I went to Poland for the first time, and I just sort of visited his property. I really thought it would be like a one and done. I didn't really think I would have any sort of long-standing relationship with this building. But then it turned out that my grandfather had tried for almost 40 years to reclaim this property before he died. And then I sort of entered the story and I picked up where he had left off. And so that is one thread, these sort of moral and legal complications in attempting to reclaim or be compensated for the property. And the other thread, the short version, is a weird and zany adventure with treasure hunters. There's a large subculture of treasure hunters mostly centered in Silesia, which is the southwestern province in Poland. And it turns out, for long, convoluted reasons, that I had a relative I didn't know I had, who is a major, like a really big deal among the treasure hunter community. He's kind of a mythological figure. And so I learned about him, and then I in turn became a celebrity among the treasure hunters in my own right. And so the other thread in the book follows sort of my descent into this subculture, pun very much intended, and sort of centered around these underground Nazi complexes that I would say form like the central mythos in that community. And so these two threads, and they sort of start overlapping in unexpected ways. And yeah, that is sort of the short version, the short summary. It's funny, like Julie, like I'm sure you've been going through this last few months, being in these positions where you summarize your book and you figure out what to say, what not to say, and
Yeah.
it's been its own little story, like how to talk about a book in 2 minutes.
Yeah. I think you did a very good job there, because of course I've read your book, and
yeah, you too. Mm-hmm.
So I guess we can start with some questions, and I'm sure more will come out as we talk. So that's
So I'm going to be asking both Julie and Menachem some questions. And if you have questions for them, you can put them in the chat. And at some point, I will relay those questions to each of them. So if it's to one of them specifically, it would be helpful in the chat if you just indicated that. I think most of us, that's just a natural curiosity about where we come from and who these people were. And, if you can get stories from a living person about all of that, to me, that just makes the richness of the experience. And I'm going to go a little off script here, but it seems like neither of you may have had stories from living relatives, that it was just a curiosity based on, in your case, Julie, the discovery of a box of keepsakes, and Menachem heard about his grandfather, but didn't know a lot about him. So I'm guessing you must have heard from your grandfather's either son or daughter. So I'm wondering if each of you could kind of speak to how many stories you may have had from living relatives in your family that inspired the quest or made you want to learn about them.
Yeah, I would say that my mother, the way I always describe it is, my mother did tell us some stories about her childhood in Vienna and about life during the Nazi occupation. She was there from 1938 until they left in 1940. Very lucky to leave by that time, and extremely lucky to get a passport and a visa out. But she never really spoke about daily life during those 2 years. That's what really began to interest me, was like, how did people survive? What did they eat? By that point, food was rationed. If you were Jewish, and people weren't wearing stars yet on their clothing until 1941, but you couldn't really go out safely and shop in the places that you had previously shopped. People knew who you were. They knew if you were Jewish. And so suddenly your life was very confined. I think my mother, for the last 2 years, really, they just lived in the apartment unless she was going out to school and coming home. But she never really spoke about that. The stories she told were kind of more, I guess they were the stories that she felt she could tell that were not as painful for her. So it was after she died, then I really had to start doing investigation to find out what may have actually happened. like Menachem, I never met either of my grandparents. They both died before I was born. In my case, my father had known them both very well. And I think after my mother died, my father was much more comfortable sharing what he remembered about my grandparents, and that helped me a lot. But in fact, a lot of the work I had to do really was at historical archives, traveling to Vienna, talking to historians, working directly with archivists, and to help me locate materials that my mother didn't, had not shared. So Menachem, maybe you can talk a bit about your experience.
Yeah, so I'm like, in contrast with Julie, I had no stories. Like there was nothing. Like it wasn't, I didn't know anything about my grandfather. I mean, he died in 1977. And so he died well after the war, but like no story of what he went through in the war or his time before the war was passed down. Like you sort of know that there's like a story there, even if you don't know what the story is. You're like, oh, I mean, of course he went, he was a Holocaust survivor and he was in the camp. So I knew that. And so you're like, there's something there, but I wasn't actually raised in a home that was all that curious about it. It was just sort of I call it an easy ignorance. It was just sort of like there, and like it obviously we knew about it. It wasn't really, we didn't talk about it because we didn't have any details about it, but it wasn't like an active part of my identity or my siblings' identity or my father's for that matter. And so my thing, I didn't really have any sentimental relationship with him. And so I guess this whole thing happened kind of strangely and unexpectedly, that I decided to enter the story and reclaim the property. For me, there was a moment when I saw those documents. I saw the documents that my grandfather had amassed in trying to reclaim the property. And they, my father actually faxed them to me when I was in Poland one summer. And then seeing those, that was a big deal for me. Like that, I felt like really for the first time in my life, I was meeting my grandfather, because it was working against such an unformed image of him. And so all of a sudden I saw what I call his frustration, which is a very human thing to see. Like I saw him trying, even though they were bureaucratic and legal letters, you could see it. Like you could see him trying every avenue he could. And there was an application in the late 50s, early 60s for people who had moved to the US, Polish nationals who moved to the US, to be compensated for property that had been expropriated. And he just messed up. Like he messed up. He did he didn't do the second application. And you're like, I saw the letter from the lawyer that said, yeah, you forgot, to do the second application. And there's no response to it, but it's very easy to sort of project and say like, wow, how terrible, like, could you imagine, you just have this opportunity, like you're never going to get an opportunity like that again. And you missed the deadline. And so for me, I really felt like I met him, like a really human part of him was introduced to me for the first time. And that's where I sort of entered and sort of decided to create that sentimental relationship with him.
That's so interesting, because I also found two batches of correspondence that my mother, first her attempt to be compensated, her mother, my grandmother, attempting to be recompensated for the theft of some insurance policies that the Nazis took. And she wrote this very gracious, pleading letter. And it was almost infuriating to me, because I just thought, oh, you just want to shake her in the past. And because really what had happened to her was so incredibly unjust. Later, I found a bundle of correspondence when my mother was attempting to get her pension from the Austrian government, and she was much less genteel. So I would say that by that point, my mother's, anger and bitterness over what had been stolen from them had really reached a pitch of frustration. So it's so interesting. My mother saved everything, and so I just was able. I didn't realize it was all there, but when I started digging, it turned out that she had saved even that correspondence.
Yeah, this is what like where our stories sort of diverge in an interesting way, is that like for me, it really didn't start from a sentimental place. Like I didn't feel emotionally attached because the sort of the quote unquote protagonist was someone I didn't know. And I wasn't comfortable sort of pretending to know him or pretending or sort of inserting sort of the default kind of sentimental arc where Julie, you know, she writes so movingly, it is about her mother. And so it's just a very different starting point.
Yeah.
So as far as your research, it sounds like you had something that gave you a start from everything that your mother saved, Julie. And Menachem, it sounds as though you kind of stumbled on it and then it just led you down this wormhole. So I wonder if each of you would talk a bit more specifically about that research. And I think in researching Jewish genealogy, there can also be a language barrier and name changing and so on. I don't know if that applies to either of you, but maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Menachem, you want to start with that?
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
You go
I'll
ahead.
carry on then. Yeah, I would say the language barrier was very significant because my mother, after she came to the United States, and she spoke German very rarely, and she never taught me and my brother to speak German, unfortunately. I can read a few words here and there, but nothing. I'm in no way conversational in German. So that was a huge impediment. And I was assisted by many, many archivists and translators and people that I had to engage in that process. I think if there are people who are interested in doing family research that is in Europe, that's often one of the biggest hurdles, is finding someone who can help you read through all these documents. So that was, the first thing. In my case, there were some things that my mother had kept, but there was a lot that I had to go and find.
Yeah, that initial trove of documents, like the documents that sort of outline my grandfather's attempt to reclaim, and I sort of lucked out. So when my grandfather died, I didn't know any of this, but when my grandfather died, he sort of just left those papers. He died very unexpectedly. He was only 56 years old. And then my grandmother just sort of held on to them. And, I don't think she really understood what was in them. And she just sort of held on. And then she sort of pestered my father in the 90s to sort of take care of them. And so my father actually made this attempt, and he had them all translated and notarized.
Oh.
And so, but then he had no idea what was in them. So I was able to read the English. Like if it never would have happened, because I never would have taken the time really to look through them, and I wouldn't have understood what they were, because there were ones in German, in Polish, Yiddish, and English. And so, yeah, that sort of thing had already been done. So I was very lucky in that regard. And then the research, moving on, yeah, I mean, it was years. And so I don't speak, and like the greatest lack of foresight in my life, never learned Polish. And so, yeah, I just relied on friends or translators, research assistants. It's like a small army to move through this world in a language you don't know. And so, yeah, constantly, I had friends like helping me with German stuff, Hebrew stuff. Like my Hebrew is fine, but like not good enough to do like a close read. And so yeah, it's just the amount of help you need is kind of staggering, like from professionals and friends alike.
Yeah, I mean, some of it though was really, I mean, one of the things that had always been strange for me was that when I went to Vienna, first as a college student, and then back in the first research trip was in 2012, I always felt kind of uneasy in Vienna. It wasn't my place. I didn't really belong there. I felt very foreign and kind of other. But by the time I went back for the last research trip for this book in 2019, by that point I knew people. There were colleagues that I had communicated with by that point for years, just by email. And then, you know, we met in person in 2019, and that was incredibly gratifying. But by that point, I felt sort of connected to the place in a very different kind of way, just because I'd been working with actual humans instead of just on a website. So
Yeah.
I'm very glad that that trip happened in 2019, one more year later, and I obviously wouldn't have been able to go, but the made all the difference. And now when I sort of, during this time, I've actually, my brother and I have been applying for Austrian citizenship. I think of it as a restoration, a kind of restitution, in that we can't reclaim property in our case, and whatever compensation the Austrian government offered has already happened. But then they changed the citizenship law, and it turns out that my brother and I could apply. In fact, my child can apply. They're taking 2 generations. And as of 2.5 weeks ago, I'm officially an Austrian citizen, dual citizen. So,
Wow.
Mazel tov.
yeah, thank you. It was a long wait. That was a long struggle. So, yeah.
So I just have another, it seems that each of you were following the trail of a specific relative rather than going back beyond that relative to a more comprehensive, I guess, genealogy of a side of your family. Is that true, or?
Well, I mean, I started really investigating. I wanted to know more about my mother and what she had not told us. But along the way, I really felt that, like Menachem, I got to know my grandparents, whom I never met, but I really did get a feel for them. And so, and then, you know, sort of an exploration really of Vienna and the Jewish community in Vienna before the war, which was a very particular Jewish community. They were very, I don't really like the word assimilated so much, but they were extremely integrated into the city, and they felt very Austrian. They did not feel like unaccepted. So I really, at the end, it sort of started with just getting to know this aspect of my mother, but then it kind of spread out much further than that.
Great.
Yeah, I didn't really have a genealogical impulse, and I actually learned nothing about my grandfather, which is the irony. I ended up finding this sort of alternate grandfather, which was his first cousin, like with the treasure hunters, and his legacy was like insanely rich. And so I did find like another branch of the family, which was very special and is actually kind of tangential in the book. But those were very important. Like I met his child, this man's name is Abraham Kaiser, the sort of celebrity among the treasure hunters. He had a child, but the child was murdered in Auschwitz, but he had 2 siblings who had gotten out before the war, and they had children. And so I met those children, and I introduced them to my father, and that was my father. My father didn't have cousins. Like, this was the first cousin he had ever met. And so that was a big deal. And then I went to Germany to meet the children of the woman who had saved Abraham, and with whom they were actually became lovers and had a relationship, a German woman. And so I met her children who still really remembered Abraham and referred to him as a father figure. So that was very, very special. So like, I wasn't really I wasn't like, I need to know my family, but once you start sort of scratching, things happen, and it becomes like really magical and special, as Julie well knows. You just can't help it. Like it doesn't really matter what you're looking for. You're going to find some weird stuff.
Yeah, I definitely found many things that I certainly was not expecting. And I went on some tangents that at the time I thought, why am I doing this? But in the end, some of them were the most fascinating parts of the story. So I think that happens when you start poking around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you found a lot of surprises along the way of going for something specific. Are there any that really stood out for you among those surprises, or how did you end up learning about these things?
Well, I mean, one of the things my mother had always talked about was that her father had been this avid mountain climber and that this was a really big part of his life. And she spoke about it, a particular trip that he had taken just after the First World War. He fought in the First World War, like many Jews did, for the emperor. And then, of course, the empire was dissolved after the end of the First World War. And he had made a friend during his army service. And the two of them remained best friends for the rest of the time that my grandfather was still in Vienna. And so they went on this kind of legendary trip together where they went down to Italy and they hiked through the Alps all the way into the Tyrol and Austria, and then they returned home. So this trip had sort of, my mother would speak about it in sort of a mythic way. Then when I started doing research, because it was one of those things where you scratch and you get interested, I was very curious about the man who issued the American visa. And my reason for being so curious was that the quotas then were so horrible. And my grandparents and my mother were hardly ideal immigrants, in that my grandfather by that point was 65. He was not in very good health. My grandmother hadn't worked in 20 years. She was a kind of upper middle class housewife, and my mother was too young to work. And so I wondered what possibly could have made the difference that this, vice consul at the American consulate would give this little family of three the much, the desperately needed visas. And then it turned out that in fact, this vice consul was also an avid mountain climber. And when I found that out, I was one of those moments where, you say you nearly fell off a chair, and I was sitting drinking coffee, looking on the web, and the very first hit for this vice consul was an obituary in the American Mountain Climbing Club. And then I felt somehow it was one of those moments where you feel the hair on the back of your neck kind of tickle. I just felt like I had found something that was the connection to connections, that it couldn't be random. And I decided to explore that further.
Great.
Yeah, the one I briefly mentioned it before, but just sort of, I got very invested in this legacy of Abraham Kaiser, who kind of became this sort of alternate grandfather for me. He was a slave laborer who had worked on these tunnels, and so his story was very much celebrated by the treasure hunters, but very much because of his diary. He had kept a secret diary that was published after the war, which sort of outlined some of the labor details. And so all these treasure hunters were obsessed with this diary because it was basically, it's a kind of long story, but it basically is the only primary document for some of these super secret Nazi tunnels. And so his legacy kind of ended at the book's end. It ends in 1945, and no one really knowed or cared much what happened to him after. But then I went to Israel and to Germany and spoke to his family. And I learned that he had not only been saved by this woman named Gertrude Froelich, but had a relationship, and she sort of held on to the memory of him until she died in 1999. And they just had an incredible story, which is a story you don't hear often, of a sort of a love affair between a Jewish prisoner and a German woman in 1944. And so that felt like something really special and really unexpected to stumble on.
Yeah.
And I know that each of you have written for a number of publications, so I'm assuming you have some kind of background in journalism. I'm wondering if that helped you be the adept researchers that each of you are?
Well, not really. I would say my first book, I had to learn on the job completely. The writing I had done prior to this was a personal memoir, and I'd written personal essays, but I'd never really done anything that I would call reporting in any kind of detail. So this was really, in the beginning, I had no idea how to go about doing it. I just knew that I had to do it. I would say that I'm a pretty dogged person once I get started on something. So, but I really did have to learn on the job. I was helped by an archivist at an institute in New York. That he was my very first contact for research. And he kind of sent me along the way, like told me who to call and gave me email address. So he sort of set me on the first parts of the research. And then after a while, I found that I really liked it. I really liked doing research. In fact, it was times I had to kind of stop myself at a certain point. It's like, okay, we've hit the end and now it's time to write pages. So
Yeah.
I don't know, Menachem, did you do reporting before?
Yeah, not extensively, but I would say, yeah, I did. I would say it was helpful. Like it's not going to be helpful in terms of like the story, because it's like I didn't do anything even 5% as like intensive or as immersive or as time consuming, like, because all those stories are sort of, one, they're much shorter, and two, they were way less personal. And so it doesn't really prepare you. It was helpful in terms of I'd had pretty extensive interviewing experience. So that was very helpful, as like kind of, the story in the book starts in 2015, but I didn't think of it as a book until 2017. And so you start to, that's a sort of interesting thing. It doesn't get discussed very often because the book is just like, oh, this happened to me. But it's never that straightforward, because at a certain point you have to decide that it's going to be a book, and then everything changes. And so like for me, it was this really, I approached it completely differently. And so I became obsessive about notes, recordings, photos, because then you're like, I literally can't miss a single detail. And it changes how you interact with people. And so that, I was very conscious of that in a way that like I had sort of spent time in that space of, you're like, okay, I'm experiencing this, but I'm also sort of recording and to a certain extent already narrating it even as it happens. And so that's like, it's weird. It's like a really weird mindset. And it was helpful to have been there already, because I get very like self-conscious, and I get very meta if I don't like anchor myself down. And so that was helpful. And so it's sort of like, but otherwise, yeah, you're gonna, I don't know. That's my first book. And so Julie could speak more about this, but my sense is that even having one book under your belt probably doesn't really prepare you for the next one, because they're really, like, it's hard to imagine. You're not going to do the same thing. And like each thing is going to present its own challenges, let alone doing it in countries where you don't speak the language. And so just like have good people on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny what you were just talking about. I think it's so true that when I first started doing the research about my mother's family, I did not think I was writing a book. I thought I was just, maybe like you, Menachem, I was just exploring it for its own sake as a family story. And then there was this moment where I was like, oh, I think this is going to become something. And then at that point, that same obsessive note-taking that you're describing had to come into play. Folders on your desktop, the photos are all organized, everything's dated, recordings that you were just sort of treating maybe a little casually or just for yourself. Suddenly you realize, oh, I might be quoting from that at a later time, so I better make sure I have all that material really well archived, because someone might, like, I have to document myself. By the time I made the trip in 2019, I was carrying a notebook where I was experiencing things and writing them down within an hour. So I carried that notebook with me everywhere. And it was, I couldn't put it into luggage or anything. I had to have it on my person the whole time because everything was in there. So I think that experience might be common. Yeah, I don't know. The next book I write, I don't think it'll be like this. It'll be something else. So
You've talked about documenting things that actually happened, but you also included fictionalized passages in these books. And can you talk about your decision to do that?
Well, I'll only speak for myself, because I know Menachem handled narrative the problems of narrative a little differently. What had happened was when I very first thought there might be a book, I thought I'm going to write a novel because there are too many narrative holes. I don't know how to fill them, so I'm going to have to fill them with my imagination. And then as the research continued, I found, oh, I can fill in a lot of these holes, and enough to the point where I feel like that I can speculate about things that might have happened, but based on research.
Mm.
I chose to use some fictional narrative techniques because I really wanted to re-inhabit the world, this lost world of Jewish Vienna before the war. And I wanted to bring readers along with that. I thought that would, and that might be the best way to accomplish that. So that was how I made that decision. But Menachem can speak to his own process.
I had like a different problem, which was one, I was waiting for a court to get back to me in order to do this. And the second you start relying on the real world, it will disappoint you and it will frustrate you. And so I had this issue of like, I couldn't finish my book because I was dealing with a court. And so, and also nothing was making sense in this weird way that, real life does. And it was really messy and chaotic. And like, it wasn't obvious for me how to extract meaning from it because it wasn't behaving properly. And so I made a million mistakes and like, everything. Turns out like the biggest mistake was I was actually trying to get the wrong building back. Like the addresses had moved and it was a huge mess. And so towards the end of my book, I sort of lament that I was like, oh, I could have done this as a novel because then everything is neat and it could make sense. And so that was my sort of reaching for the novel, but ultimately I felt it was the right move not to write it as a novel because it doesn't deserve to make sense. As like the real meaning is the struggle to make meaning. And so like you have to sort of figure it out on the fly. The fiction is neat. Like it doesn't work unless it's not neat, and it would have been a lot less quote unquote true. And so, but I certainly for many months while I was sort of waiting for a court to get back to me, I was like, ugh, if it was a novel, I could just snap my fingers and make it happen. And also underlying this is like, again, I didn't know my grandfather. And so I was like, if it were a novel, I could sort of just conjure him. I could make him up and then I could sort of make any meaning. And I was like very uncomfortable with sort of representing my grandfather. I was like, I don't have the kind of moral authority he does because I'm just like a schmuck who grew up in Toronto and my issues like vis-a-vis history are not that grand, but my grandfather's are. And so I was like, if he could be the protagonist, that, it certainly takes quite a load off, it just, everything is just, it's right there. It's very charged. And so I think the novel has like those kind of advantages, but ultimately for this story where the messiness is essential to it, nonfiction was the proper route.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I chose to write it as a memoir, but announce to the reader the times when I might be stepping out of that and speculating. But I wouldn't have felt comfortable doing that if I hadn't done all the research I'd done. Then I would have felt that I was misrepresenting a person that I never met. And that would be, I wouldn't have felt comfortable with that at all.
So I have one last question that I'm going to ask the two of you. We have one question in chat so far that I'll follow up with. And so if anybody else has any questions, you can put them in the chat now. And when we're done with this phase of it, we'll move on to that. So if you could each talk about the connections that you see with the between the time period leading up to the Nazi takeover of Austria and in Europe in 1938 and our recent politics.
Yeah, well, that's pretty charged. I would just say that I was writing and finishing my book and observing what was happening. And of course, the thing that made made it so impossible for a lot of Viennese Jews to get out was, were the quotas, the US immigration quotas. The quotas never changed, even long after the US government knew perfectly well what was happening. They knew about the concentration camps. They knew what was happening there. One might read otherwise, but it's just not true. They were quite aware of what was happening. But like now, immigration was such a loaded topic, and people were so opposed to immigration that there was no support for changing those quotas, even in 1940, when things were really getting very desperate. So of course, it's hard to not look at the situation that we have now. And, we've got people fleeing from a war in Afghanistan. We have other immigrants. Why do people leave their homes? It's not like people want to leave their homes. They leave because of war, poverty, now I would say climate related to climate change and the devastation of the natural environment. But the reality is that my mother and her parents would never have left Vienna unless they'd had to. They loved Vienna. They were very Austrian. They were very happy there. They had a very good life until 1938. So it is hard to, it's hard to look at the world that we're living in now and not see a lot of parallels. I wonder, Menachem, do you find the same? I mean, I don't know what the quotas were like as far as people getting out of Poland, but it was.
Yeah, I'll take the question in a little bit of a different direction. So like when the book began, I will say what really was sort of a strange thing to experience was one of the subplots in my book is sort of Nazi symbology and this sort of the fetishization of Nazis in large, and also in terms of conspiracy theories. The most research intensive chapter in my book by far was devoted to very strange conspiracy theories with like Nazis at the center of them, including like time travel and anti-gravity. And so one of the really bizarre things to see was that Nazis became headline news. Like when I started this book, Nazis were not part of the national discourse. And then midway through, Trump was elected, and all of a sudden you're just reading about Nazis on like the front page, and that was very unsettling and very weird. And then conspiracy theories, which was like a fringe research topic, all of a sudden became, and this was especially since COVID, but even before COVID, the whole discourse surrounding conspiracy theory became much, much more prominent. And also my central thesis regarding the conspiracy theories, that even ones that seem ridiculous can in fact be very dangerous. And so it's been quite something to see that borne out in real life. Like it's no longer a complicated argument to make, because we have quite an abundance of real world examples, unfortunately. But yeah, that was something that was very startling to see these things that I thought were kind of dead or very fringe topics become very much not fringe.
Yeah.
And so the question that we have from one of the attendees is asking Menachem to speak about the treasure hunters, what they are and what they do.
Sure. So treasure hunters it's a little bit of a misnomer. That's how they got translated in the press. And so basically it's a very large subculture, easily over 100,000 people. And so there's a range. You have, on one hand, you have sort of like hobbyists who go out with metal detectors on the weekend. And then on the other end, you have these very, sophisticated and sometimes even sponsored expedition groups using high-end equipment like LiDAR or radar or magnetometers. They are looking for treasure. That part is true. They're looking for, valuables or gold or whatever it is. And occasionally they do actually find stuff. It's not common, but they do, which was left over, either stuff that the Nazis hid, or actually more often stuff that German nobility that had to fled. You have, particularly after the war, there was a much more nasty version of this, I would say, which was people digging up Jewish graves, especially in sites of massacre, for anything from teeth to valuables that the Nazis had overlooked. So there is I would say, a complicated pedigree. Today, it's something much more like a hobby, and most of these guys kind of see themselves as amateur historians / spelunkers. Like it's kind of weird. But I would say beyond just material, a lot of them are also just looking for answers. So these are sites that aren't like fully explained, and so they are very obsessed with trying to figure out what they are. I will say, so some of them are very serious, and so like some of them are very serious historians, and some of their contributions have really added to our knowledge. It's also important to mention that these sites are way off the map in terms of Holocaust history. And so like these are sites that get basically no institutional attention and very, very few researchers. And so for better or for worse, it is the treasure hunters who are doing the work on the ground. The example I often quote is one of the treasure hunters, a guy outside a town called Vinica, actually showed me a concentration camp that he had discovered. Like this was a concentration camp that was wiped off the map. Like it is not on the map. And people sometimes don't appreciate, because they see how extensive Holocaust research is, they don't appreciate just how much there is left to do. And there is in like the Gross Rosen concentration camp network, which is sort of where I was based doing my research. We don't even know the precise number of camps that were in the network. And so there's a tremendous amount that is not done. And so some of these treasure hunters are doing sort of valuable work. On the whole, I would call them sort of very amateur historians and extremely amateur archaeologists who the real archaeologists hate because they always mess everything up. And they're having fun. They're totally having fun. They like get together. It's mostly men, not all men, and they hang out in the forest and get drunk, and then in the morning sort of like clean sites or search for things. And they're often conspiracy theorists, not all the time. And, they have a good time.
What was really fascinating to me while I was working was how many people are still researching the Holocaust. I mean, it is, and some of them are young. These are people they've devoted, most of them are not Jewish, at least the people that I encountered in Austria. They're not Jewish because there's so few Jews in Austria. I mean, of the original population of 200,000 in Vienna in 1938, that's out of a population of 2 million. Now there's about 9,000, and very, very few of those people are descended from the Jews who lived there before the war. In fact, they come from Russia. So they either perished in the camps or they managed to get out. Very, very few hid for the duration, although I have recently spoken to someone who hid out for the entire war. But what really has blown me away is how many young historians get involved in this work, and they're devoting their entire careers to the study of the Holocaust. There's so much left to research. Just as Menachem is saying, it's just kind of endless. And I think because the Germans made such an effort to hide what they had done, some stuff is perhaps gone forever, but not all of it. And that's what, I was really surprised was how dedicated some of these historians are, and how much work is ongoing. They're finding stuff all the time. So.
Well, that's fascinating. I think that's something that most of us are certainly not aware of at all. And it will be really interesting to see what comes out of it and, what sees the light of day, I guess, beyond a select group of people. So I don't know if there are any more questions. If there are, I'm not seeing them, but so I think we'll wrap things up. If you have anything else you want to throw in the chat, please do so now before we conclude. But as I said before, this recording will be up on the Scoville Library YouTube channel. And I think I will also share it with Julie and Menachem, and it will be up on their websites. So they each have websites with their name and then .com. And there are links to purchase their book from their websites. And there will also be a link from the YouTube recording. And we do have a copy of the books in the library if you'd like to borrow them. So I think I've really enjoyed this. I think it's been fascinating on all counts. So I thank you very much, and I thank everybody for attending.
Thank you so much. It's been a real
Thanks
pleasure.
so much, Claudia. Thank you, everybody.
Well, you're very welcome, and good night all. And I'm going to end the recording and end this session. So enjoy.
Good night.
Take care.
Bye.